theme of today's conference is Not Ashamed, and I have a great advantage because I choose the themes of conferences and I just chose the title of my speech. So I'm going to bring us back here for what is the second to last session. We've still got to do a Q&A, but in the second to last session, bring us back to that theme and unpack it because it is a biblical phrase. It comes out of Romans chapter 1, verse 16. And it actually used to perplex me for a time. Why would Paul have chosen to use that phrase, I am not ashamed? Because elsewhere Paul would say it positively, which would be more natural, to say I glory in the gospel, or I'm even proud of the gospel maybe, or whatever it is. He doesn't state it as a positive, he states it as a negative. And I ask myself, well, why? And I think there's a very simple explanation. I think that Paul knows, he understands, he sees that there is a tendency, there's a temptation, there's a risk amongst the people that he is writing to that they might actually be ashamed. He knows that there's a particular pitfall that faces every Christian. And he knows that it's a particular pitfall that is amplified in a society like the one at the centre of ancient Rome. Remember, he's writing to the church in Rome, the heart of the Roman Empire. And in their society, he knows the problem is amplified. You might say, well, what kind of society? Well, it's striking to look at what kind of society the ancient Romans lived in. It was a society where children were routinely left out to die by exposure in the hours after their birth, and the Christians became famous for picking them up and saving their lives. We wouldn't do that today. That's barbarism. But abortion, right? We have a sophisticated version of the same thing. Or indeed it was a society in which at the centre of temple worship and pagan practice lay homosexual conduct, androgyny and all this kind of thing. And again, of course, we don't worship idols. That would be very, very barbaric. But of course, we have a modern version of pride, do we not? Or as a society in which the weekend crowds at the stadium actually did outstrip even the largest crowds at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. 250,000 people was the capacity of the Circus Maximus. Pretty incredible. A society in which the idiom bread and circuses arose because the people were craving hedonistic pleasures, they were craving basic entertainment, and so long as they were fed and they were full and they were entertained, well, all was well, little else mattered. A society in which public expressions of Christianity would earn you a place at the fringe of society. You did not belong. You were one about whom many rumours were started. One that was pushed to the edges. And indeed the early church had a huge problem because they didn't participate, particularly in temple ritual. And they were excluded from society. It was a world in which the Emperor Nero would marry two boys. One he would call his husband, the other he would call his wife. And he did this after he had kicked his pregnant wife to death in what you might call a domestic violence epidemic. It's pagan Rome. And isn't it remarkable to look into, have a window into some of the problems of that world and see how familiar it sounds? There's nothing new under the sun. And Paul writes from pagan Rome, the city at the centre of this great empire with a moral sickness of soul, actually. But he writes from pagan Rome to what many cultural analysts and commentators are now calling neo-pagan Australia, or the neo-pagan West. And it's into that world that Paul knows he must say first, be not ashamed. Be not ashamed. And he says that to his world, he says it to our world. And you consider our world for a moment. You consider the way this sort of thing plays out. Israel Folau is the case on everybody's tongue. By society's standards, Israel Folau's beliefs are at best outrageous. It was interesting, it was very hard to find during the height of that issue anybody who was out there who was actually defending Israel Folau in what he believed. They were defending him only in his right to say it. And I remember I was reading one commentator who usually takes a very conservative approach on these issues. And he said, look, obviously I don't support what Israel Folau believes. Obviously it's ridiculous. For example, if those are the criteria for hell, then I will see you down there. And I thought, well, I guess he gets it. Is that not the point? But of course, the idea in a society like this that I would be judged and found wanting is outrageous. You know, it's all the isms and the phobias and the patriarchy in society. It's not me. Never. Outrageous idea. And actually, at the heart of the outrage is that very notion that I would be judged, that I would give account. It's outrageous. Now, that's at best, mind you. At worst, his ideas are deadly. I was charged many times in the media, aren't you just killing people? Aren't people dying because of these things that are being said? As you know, far from it being an idea that is raised to harm anybody, it is an idea that is raised for quite the opposite reason. Christians have found something. They've found peace, they've found life, and there's an answer here that people might find offensive, but it is nonetheless the answer communicated out of love. And you know, Israel Folau has borne the wrath of society for saying what he said. He has been placed at the fringe of society, like I said, was going to happen in the Roman world. He's earned himself a place among the ranks of disgraced, banned for life footballers. It's not the most salubrious crowd in the world, especially when you consider all the ones that haven't been banned for life. For domestic violence, for public disgracing themselves in public, unruly, all sorts of dreadful things. No, he's earned himself in the worst category, a place in the worst category. And also, he's had to pay. He's had to pay for speaking. Not only has he found himself in that position, but his father's been targeted, his church has been targeted, his cousin's been targeted, and most grievous of all, his wife has been targeted. Then his GoFundMe was targeted, then GoFundMe targeted him, and then we took it up, and now we've been targeted, and we're currently under investigation by the federal regulator. We're going to be okay, but it just shows you how this goes. And you know, unfortunately, it's like this more and more. John was up here before, and he talks of the work of the Human Rights Law Alliance. And you know, as you go through a series of case studies from the last few years, you see more and more this becomes the cost of belief, of being Christian. You know, Joshua, the university student who prayed on campus for a friend of his and was suspended, excluded. Patricia, the medical doctor who gave a presentation on gender and sexuality, that being her career-long area of expertise, because it's a Christian talk, she loses a particular accreditation that she had. Or the couple who have applied to become foster parents of children under 6, but having been quizzed about their religious faith, what's the outcome? They get told that their home is unsafe for children, and so they can't foster children. They fail the criteria for making a safe home or some technical speak like that. Or Campbell Markham, the Christian pastor who ended up at the Supreme Court because he wrote a blog on the Christian view of marriage. Kathy Clubb, ended up at the High Court of Australia for making an offer of help to a woman near an abortion clinic. Every Attorney General in the country was against her in that case. You had gowns and lawyers from one end of the room to the other. What did she do? Made an offer of help. Why? She'd been doing it for years, saved 300 babies' lives and helped their mothers in their time of need. She is now a criminal. She can't get home insurance, for example. Criminal conviction. Jason, taken to the State Administrative Tribunal because a photography client, someone who wanted him to photograph her family, he divulged his Christian beliefs to her. Didn't refuse service or anything like that, just told her what he believes. I heard of a guy who runs a homestay for students. And he's had those students taken off him because he queried the transgender stuff that's going on in schools. And he's not only had one taken off, but more than one from different schools. And those children have been warned about him. But below the legal threshold, you know, I've noticed a number of things. We're always accused of having evil motives or evil intent. I noticed when I was doing the media, it felt like I spent a week with someone nattering in my ear, just saying, you're a very wicked person, you're very bad. You know, because you gave that money to Israel Folau, 3 Rwandan children are now dead. Because, people are given to him instead of supporting the needy. Oh, because you're out there saying these things, young people are killing themselves in droves and jumping off bridges. Martyn, what kind of car do you drive? I mean, how rich are you? It's the wrong question to ask me, by the way. My car's 20 years old. But so it goes on. It's accusation, accusation, accusation. And I thought it's funny, the devil is actually called the great accuser in the Bible. And that is so much a function. What is the one we usually deal with? Hater. You hate. That's your motive. You're a bigot, really. That's your problem. You have phobias of people. False accusation. But also just general disgust at the views that Christians hold. You look at Margaret Court being in Perth. What's the general disgust that she faces? Get her name off that arena because she has aberrant belief. Do when it comes to that temptation to be ashamed, we all face it. Actually, the Apostle Paul probably faced it more than anybody. The Apostle Paul, he was the Pharisee of Pharisees. He was a great person of great status, a very righteous man. He was a person educated under Greek thought. He was a great intellect. He was a giant in his day. But you know what Paul writes? He says, I have become a fool for Christ's sake. You can always feel in those words the weight of what that means to him. He's had to become a fool. And how shameful it is for some of us to be considered a fool for Christ's sake. And yet Paul says into that environment to those people who are listening to him, he says, be not ashamed. It's one of the first things he says. Ashamed of what? He says, be not ashamed of the gospel. What does he mean by the gospel? It means quite a lot, actually. That verse in Romans 1, most theologians will tell you it's the thesis for the book. It's his topic sentence, if you like. He's unpacking what he's going to talk about. And he's saying, I'm going to talk about how that the gospel is the revelation of the righteousness of God to all who believe. And he runs through that book. And he goes through how that the righteousness of God is revealed in God's wrath against sin, chapter 1, 2, 3. Then he goes on to talk about how the righteousness of God is revealed, is imputed to us by faith in Jesus Christ, chapter 4, chapter 5. And then he goes on to talk about how that the righteousness of God grows in our own hearts over time and how that looks, chapter 6, chapter 7. And then, of course, he deals with his accusation. But if God, that means God's unrighteous because he's condemning some people and he's saving others. And he says, oh, no, God's not unrighteous. Chapter 9, 10, 11 defends God's dealing with the human race in history. But there's an important part we haven't got to yet. How long is Romans? Chapter 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And up until this point, there's, I think, been 5 statements where he said, you need to do something. It's all been pure theology. And then at chapter 12, he turns around and says, therefore. And every verse from there to the end is do this, be that, change in this way. And he talks about the righteousness of God revealed through the converted lives of those who've believed. And Paul says, this, what I'm writing to you, I'm not ashamed. And so it comes to us with the message itself and the fruit of the message, the life, of which we cannot be ashamed. And so I see this temptation comes to us nonetheless in a number of ways. And it comes to us in a number of, we fall into the trap really in 3 ways. We are ashamed, we do shrink back. We are not all that we should be. Either out of fear, because it can be scary. I've been scared, let me tell you, very scared. Fear, compromise. What happens when everything around gets difficult? We change, we compromise. And the sin of silence, where we simply say and do nothing. All those 3 things are very real. And yet, all 3 of those things are addressed in specific detail in the Bible. All 3 issues are warned against. And when you come to the question of fear, the number 1 command in the Bible is fear not. Is it 365 times? Someone told me once, 1 for every day of the year. Now, where have we come from? What have we fallen from in the fact that fear would be an issue when it is the number 1 thought in the New Testament? I think we've forgotten the promises of Christ. When Jesus thought of the times in which we are going to live, of the times in which, the more difficult times in which the apostles were about to live, Do you know, when he thought about the reviling and the persecuting and all this kind of stuff that happens, when he thought about the fact that, there might be legal cases like this. Remember, the apostles were taken into the old anti-discrimination tribunal, the Sanhedrin, and they were charged with hate speech. You need to stop speaking in this name. And they were beaten and sent away. All faced the same thing. But when he thought about this, he didn't start where we start, which is down here. Do you know, I've done talks, and I remember doing one where I did a whole series of case studies to try and sketch out the reality of the situation we're facing. It was all these legal cases. And of course, I got half an hour through the talk, and the whole room was so low. Everyone was really, really depressed, and I could feel it. And I said, but that's what I wanted, because I was going to make a point. And I said, but you know what? There is hope. And there's a guy on the front row, the poor fella, who goes, oh! There's a great big sigh of relief. And that's how we feel. It just makes us a bit low. But you know, when Jesus thought about this before we ever thought about it, he didn't start on a low note. He started on a high note. Blessed are the persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Is he thinking of our circumstances? Of course he is. People say, but man, we're not fed to the lions, we're not persecuted. No, keep tracking with him. Reviling, angry disgust, of course, we just talked about that. Evil speaking, false motives, false imputation, we just talked about that. He's thinking about our circumstances. And it's amazing that he starts by saying, you are blessed. And it's a promise. He doesn't say if you psych yourself up sufficiently, you might feel blessed. He says, no, you absolutely will be. Do you know, we shrink back from the prospect of challenges against us in fear. But actually the whole teaching of the New Testament is that in trials, God teaches us something that we otherwise could never have known about him. That's why the apostles said, rejoice in trials. They weren't making some vain, desperate effort to try and dress it up. Because you see, I used to think Paul and Silas were insane because they sang hymns in jail all night. I used to think that, the Apostle Paul himself, what drove him? Escaping over the wall in a basket, running away from the authorities, people turning on him, the challenges and difficulties of his life. And yet he wrote a whole book called Philippians on rejoicing in the Lord. I think what's going on with this man, in my time at the Human Rights Law Alliance, I could only mention one person of all the people we dealt with who wouldn't say that what happened was for the best. 21-year-old Joshua, the university student, what will he say? That legal case was one of the best things that ever happened to him. And he said it on a stage with me. Because he said, I woke up, God taught me something about my faith, and it's made me better. Do you know, in fact, the promise here is that something of the kingdom of heaven, something of the knowledge of God and future glory and happiness becomes closer to us now. That's the blessing. And so far from starting on a negative note, Jesus starts on a high note. I used to have a youth group, and we used to have these sessions called Areopaguses, because the Areopagus was the forum in which all the Greek philosophers would come together and reason and talk together. You remember Paul addressed the Areopagus in the book of Acts. And so we'd sit down and have a philosophy hour. And so I'd get there and I'd say, we're going to learn a big philosophical word today. I'd write up, it was utilitarianism. And I said, right, utilitarianism. What I'm going to tell you it means, and all the philosophers in the room will wince, but it's very simple, it's for kids. I said, what it means is that life is all about maximum happy and minimum sad. And then you need to maximize the happy and minimize the sad. I said, we're going to study the book of Job this year. And I'm just going to tell you, that's not God's idea. That's somebody else's idea. That's a guy called Jeremy Bentham and a few others. God is not a utilitarian. And he isn't. And we were told in the New Testament, I remember growing up, there's this preacher came to my church, and he was a Scottish guy, and he had a tremendously booming voice, and he'd lean over the pulpit like this. And I just remember this moment, as you have these memories seared on your brain from your childhood, of him leaning over the lectern and pointing at everyone and saying, "Who told you it was going to be easy?" Like this. And I'm sitting there as a kid going, "I don't know." And it's stuck in my head. I thought, well, where did we learn that? It's not in the Bible. Jesus didn't say it. The apostles didn't say it. It's not, here's the thing. No, not easy. But, yes, blessed. Right? There's something greater. The holiness without which no one will see the Lord, actually, is what it's put in the New Testament. And you know, when we don't trust that promise of God, that promise of Jesus Christ, we fear and we're ashamed. And we don't fulfill what it is that we're supposed to do. You know, people turn around and they say, oh, the second issue I see all the time is this huge problem of compromise. And Jesus deals with it in the same breath. You know, what do we do when the world says that we're fools? We try very hard to look very clever. What do we do when we're told that truth is hate? Well, we obediently avoid the hatey truths and we speak about the lovey truths. According to whom? Them, not God. What do we do when the world ostracizes someone, puts them to the fringe and says, well, they're a pariah? We avoid them too. Oh, well, we preface everything we say with, well, I don't agree with everything he does, but, and we distance ourselves. But you know, if the salt has lost its taste, it's no good for anything except to be trampled under people's feet. It's a very strong saying, actually, when you read it in that context. Because when does the salt lose its taste? The salt loses its taste when its environment changes it, when the moisture gets in. When that which is around it seeps in and compromises it and changes. And you know what? We're called in times like this not to compromise, but to hold up in our Christian integrity. That is so important. Do you know, it's in two fronts. It's in our actions. You know, I always give this example of the anti-discrimination tribunal that Peter and John get dragged into, and they get told, you know, stop speaking in this name. Do you know, when they left that place, they didn't do any of the things that we'd probably do if we were a Christian ministry and we got an angry legal letter from the Human Rights Commission in our mail saying you need to stop speaking this way. You know, we'd probably have a strategy committee. And we'd probably sit down and think to ourselves, how can we alter what we're doing to please the Human Rights Commission? And we'd come up with a whole bunch of things. Or maybe we won't use trigger words like Christ, the anointed. The Jews get really upset about that, so we won't do that. We'll take that bit out. You know, maybe we won't go near. We'll put safe exclusion zones around the synagogues because that's, you know, difficult. Even though a lot of people are willing to listen in the synagogues, it's also where the angry people are. So we won't go there. Do you know, why don't we just stop proselytizing? Why don't we just have, you know, friendly conversations with people in the street? And there might be an opportunity, maybe, for them to see the witness of Christ in our lives, and we'll just stop it there. Now, there's a time and a place for a lot of those things, but you notice they didn't do it in response to the demands of the Sanhedrin. They didn't do it to march to the beat of their drum, because they had the words of Christ ringing in their ears, which said, "You are my witnesses to the ends of the earth. Go and preach the gospel to all nations." How could they stop? They could not stop. They were marching to the beat of that drum. And so they left and they said, "Lord, grant us boldness to continue to speak." And so they did. And they were fierce in their lack of compromise. But there's another thing I want to add here. We cannot compromise either in our character. Do you know, one of the areas in which we do, the salt actually makes a difference simply by being what it should be. And it starts in our hearts, it starts in our lives to be what we should be. One of the compromises I see everywhere, and it's tragic, is that the world we live in is increasingly piled up with filth. And we encounter all around us opportunities for our thoughts to be ruined, for our minds to be polluted. And what do we do in those circumstances? We just lower our standards. That's what we do. And yet, you know what? It's this simple sometimes. I say this in the young people groups that I do. I say it's actually this simple. Draw close to Christ, know his word, and kill sin in your life. If we don't do that, we will never be the salt. We will never be what we're called to be, which makes the difference in our circumstances simply through its integrity. Now, the lesson of the salt is it's our difference that makes the difference. It's not our drawing into sameness. It's not our compromise. And we should never be ashamed of difference. But you know, that's not the only threat that we have. The sin of silence is very real. And it's something else that we do. We are silent. As you know, I never realised how I got away with it before I joined ACL. I used to be able to judge people and decide whether they were a sort of a Christian-friendly person before I had to tell them what I really thought about the world. But you know, I got a job, and Australians have this frustrating tendency. And the frustrating tendency that Australians have is to say, so what do you do? And it was 2014 at the end of the year, and I'd gone to ANU to study my Masters. And I was sitting there in the classroom and got chatting to these two people at my table. And they said, so what do you do? And I thought, and I said, I'm a lobbyist. And they said, and I thought, please make it go away. And they said, who do you lobby for? And here's the moment where you can't hide any longer. And you can't just go, Australian Christian Lobby, what do you do? No, I had to declare it. And they physically went like this as I said it. So shocked, because they'd been talking to me for a while, and they must have thought I'd have two heads or something. But see, I got away with it. What was the problem? The light was under a basket. They couldn't see who I was. And you know, a light that's under a basket does nothing. Silence turns the light off. Do you know the graphics for this conference? This is Australia and all the lights that have been called to be lights in their different communities, to shine forth the truth of who we are, who has changed us, and therefore his word and his gospel. And when that light is off, you've only got a vacuum that will be filled with darkness. That's the cost. And the challenge here is as hard as the salt statement, you know. He says, do you know, under a basket, no good. Better, lampstand to give light to the house, right? People can see. Make sure some people see. But here's the really, really challenging point, which I tremble to say, a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden. What are you doing that's that obvious? How can people see the light? But you know, when the light does go off, that space will be filled and our work won't be done because we were silent, because we were ashamed. The lesson of the light is this: if we are silent, we will be silenced because that space will not remain unoccupied. Do you know, Isaiah 59 tells us that when truth stumbles in the public squares, that vacuum is filled by several things. You know, if truth goes, it goes on to then say, well, righteousness will go. Because if there's no truth about right and wrong, that's going to fall apart. The moral compass has disappeared. What's the cost of that? Well, the next clause is justice will be turned back. And when justice goes, what do you have? Injustice. And I look at the world around us and I say, well, what's been the cost of truth stumbling in education? Huge. Massive. Generation of people brought up on postmodern custard. That's your average millennial. Sorry, that's me. I was brought up on postmodern custard. Fortunately, read some other good people and it counteracted it. But see, also, you look at what's going on now with the ideological agendas, and some mention's been made today of the gender stuff. What we forget sometimes is the devastating cost of that to real lives. Do you know, Walt Heyer came out here to Australia, one of the first ever gender reassignment patients in the 1950s. And you know, Walt lived as a woman for a number of years before realising it hadn't solved his problems, and he detransitioned and he's become a Christian now, and he does counselling, a transgender regret counselling, and he has met with thousands of people all around the world who are in exactly the same position as he is. And he says he sits down with these people and he says to them, you know, what went wrong? And he says all of them can usually answer the question quickly, and he says more than half will say child sexual abuse. And that's what paediatricians used to look for when gender dysphoria presented. But now, oh no, as he feels, so he is. Puberty blockers, hormones. Do you know, Walt is talking to these people, and the suicide rates is off the charts because, of course, the gender reassignment doesn't work. And whilst he's talking to these people, and he's talking to them before the tsunami, there's a 1,000% increase in minors on hormone therapy in the major gender clinics of Australia. And there's a tsunami coming through. Or what's the cost of truth stumbling in politics? It's pretty serious. You know, when you don't have truth in politics, all you've got is power. That's a very, very ugly business, power in politics. Policies are coming through that seek to stop the spread of the truth. You know, for example, why would they target Christian schools as they did at the end of last year? They target Christian schools because I went to a Christian school. I tell you, there's a lot of kids at that Christian school who weren't Christians when they started and didn't come from Christian families, but they were Christians when they finished. And 2 pastors of major churches in Brisbane today were in my year level, and they were not Christians when they started. And if you can interrupt people from coming to a knowledge of the truth, there's people with an agenda who will, and when they have political power, they'll pursue it. And so the cost of truth stumbling is very severe. And that's why Paul knows that in a world like this, we cannot afford to be ashamed. We can't. Excuse me. We cannot compromise. We cannot be silent. And we cannot fear. Because there's actually a tremendous fruit involved in speaking. And speaking up for the truth. You know, in the current climate, let's just take one case study. The case of Israel Folau. Do you know, there was a situation in which there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of, as I said before, a lot of challenge, a lot of difficulty. But you know, as I reflect on this, there couldn't be a better case study of what I'm trying to say. Do you know, by being bold and standing firm for Israel, I mean him really, because that's what he did. He said, I can't before God retract. I can't. And he didn't. It's amazing what happened from there. Do you know, by simply refusing to be silent, what's happened? Well, actually, first thing that's happened is that the gospel has actually been proclaimed on national television to millions of people. You saw that the truth that God's judgment is real, that he is true, and that the only answer is the love of Christ's cross. I couldn't believe how many times I got the opportunity to say that. You know, that every time they asked me what I believed, I said, well, let me tell you what I believe, you know, and away we'd go. And radio, TV, the whole business. I mean, the project even gave us a double-barreled go at it. It was great. And do you know what? We don't know what the fruit of that is, but that's a good thing. That's the light shining. It's a very good thing. Do you know, I actually called Israel in the heat of some of this, and we were chatting, and I said to him, look, I said, you know, how are you doing? And he's like, I'm doing great, man, really good. And I thought, really? You know, and I said, why? And he said, he goes, I've just been reflecting. And he said, the reality is, he says, you know, the Word of God and my sermons and everything, just repeated all over the world. I said, yep, that's true. And he said, and you know, they don't realise that the Word of God has power. He says, and they're just proclaiming it left, right and centre. And I thought to myself, wow, okay, that's a very level response, heaven-headed response from the guy. But he saw the great blessing of that. But you know, the other thing that's happened, and I was talking to a senator the other day who said this, I was saying, look, I've been disappointed about the Israel Folau thing, that it didn't have much political impact. You know, the Prime Minister didn't say much, and you know, it was all kind of swept under the rug. And the senator said to me, no, don't think that. Don't think that, because actually, the whole nature of the political conversation has changed. They said, look, actually in the coalition party room, if you were to raise religious freedom just a couple of months ago, no one would have been interested in talking to you. But now they pick it up straight away. And everyone is interested in pursuing the issue and talking about the issue. Everyone has the Folau case on the tip of their tongue. And it's completely changed the dynamic. And in fact, we were in with a meeting with the people drafting this new Religious Discrimination Act. And they were saying, you know, oh yeah, so we're keen sort of like to put this in here because that'll protect people against the Folau kind of scenario. And I was sitting there thinking, really? It's incredible that they're actually talking that way. It's changed the political conversation. And you know, there is great fruit. There is great fruit in simply not being ashamed, as Paul said. You know, there's something else that Paul says. Why is he not ashamed in the context? It's because of what he has. The great priceless treasure that's in his hand. He says, we've been given the power of God for salvation. Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
the idea that this is actually not even our power. If we but do that which we are called to do in faithfulness, God's power will be used. And that takes a great burden off my shoulders. That's why I quote the Bible often. Margaret Court taught me this. She said, use God's words, because then it's not on you anymore. It's a great point. We need to realise that actually when this is done, whether it's the proclamation of the word, whether it's the witness in the life, done in faith, it's God's work that comes out of it. And he has promised that that work will continue. I ask people, do we believe that? And do we believe it enough for it to convict us and change us? And he's promised a couple of things will come out of it, you know. You go back to Matthew 5, and there where Jesus has said, you know, there's actually two realities here. He says, firstly, you'll be persecuted. People will revile you. They will utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account, etc., etc. And you think, negative. But then he turns around and he says, and people will see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. And you go, huh? Dual reality. And we've made a big mistake. Or we say, because of the first reality, we're doing it wrong. Or because of the first reality, we need to compromise. Or because of the first reality, we need to be silent. Or because of the first reality, we need to be fear. No, there's a promise. Push through. Do it faithfully and do it. I'm not speaking against wisdom here. Do it as best as you can. And the promise is that there will be fruit from your efforts. You know, they persecuted the prophets who were before them. Look at what they did. They persecuted the apostles in the book of Acts. Look at what they did. They persecuted Jesus, the Son of God. They killed him. And look at what he did. And so, in that same pattern, you see this dual reality playing out before our very eyes. That it is a promise of God. And you know, the apostles, through doing all that they did, being not ashamed, wow. You know, actually the empire was transformed in 400 years. It's incredible. But not only that, but the Christian church spread like wildfire right throughout the entire world, almost to the ends of the earth. But you know what? Here's the thing. I actually made an error there. I said, well, there's the bad, the persecution, the reviling, the evil speaking. And there's the good, the glorifying God because of what's been seen and the light that's shining. But I'm wrong, they're both good. Because what did Jesus say? He said, actually, you will find in the fullness of time, and as you trust my promises, that even the bad stuff isn't bad. Because blessed are the persecuted for righteousness' sake. And so I think with a full worldview, looking at pagan Rome/Australia, there's nothing more that we need than the words of the Apostle Paul who said, be not ashamed. Thank you.